In 2024, the world is once again caught in the whirlwind of a race in space. This competition didn't start with a spectacular space launch, but originated from a brief post on social media. Caption: Race in Space, a new chapter? On February 14th, Mike Turner, the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, made a shocking statement on the X platform, formerly Twitter. He claimed his committee possessed information about a serious national security threat and called on U.S. President Joe Biden to immediately declassify all information related to this incident. Turner's statement was vague but caused a significant stir. Astute journalists quickly discovered that the threat Turner mentioned came from Russia. Further reports indicated that intelligence obtained by the U.S. suggested Russia may plan to deploy nuclear weapons in space, targeting the destruction of U.S. satellites. Caption: Russian nuclear weapons, a new threat in space? Although Russia had not conducted any new space launches, the news still caused a huge shock in the U.S. political landscape. What kind of weapon was this? Why did it cause such panic? The threat posed by this weapon was significant. It could destroy not only U.S. military satellites, but also a large number of commercial satellites, resulting in severe global economic and security consequences. Russia could use two methods. One was crude, arming satellites with nuclear warheads and causing destruction in orbit. The other involved installing nuclear warheads on satellites to destroy satellites in orbit en masse. The latter method was to use nuclear-powered satellites using onboard lasers or particle beams to destroy satellites in swathes. Once the news broke, intelligence agencies were now busy figuring out who leaked the secret and then revoking their access. These people were trying to secretly retain their access. U.S. spy agencies privately warned European allies that this issue was first discovered at the beginning of the previous year when U.S. intelligence noticed a series of secret satellite launches by Russia, which were closely monitored. Further investigation revealed that they were developing a weapon capable of destroying all satellites in Earth's orbit. U.S. officials warned that Russia might send this device into space this year. Now, European allies were also frightened and were discussing countermeasures with the U.S. Orbital nuclear weapons, in layman's terms, place nuclear bombs on satellites, which, once in orbit, could suddenly launch a small missile to attack the target satellite. This method had many advantages: proximity, favorable angles, and high accuracy. The small missile's acceleration was also fuel efficient, as it already had initial velocity from being in orbit. Most importantly, co-orbital weapons were hard to detect. They could be secretly deployed weeks in advance, and by the time of launch, the small missile's heat signature was minimal, with the short distance and duration leaving the target satellite no time to detect it. Nuclear-powered satellites could generate extra energy, which could be used to fire laser cannons or particle cannons or to give power to radar and other anti-satellite technologies. Therefore, these satellites could change orbits more frequently, be more flexible, and be harder to detect than traditional satellites. Using a laser gun or particle cannon, target satellites could be shot down. Theoretically, these weapons were as powerful as nuclear bombs, but would not produce as much space debris and radiation, and there was no risk of self-damage. Regarding Russia's space weapons program, opinions within the U.S. intelligence community were divided. Some believed Russia could deploy space-based nuclear warheads soon, but others doubted their capability to build such weapons. Russia had indeed been researching nuclear-powered space tugs which could carry electronic warfare equipment and possibly attack satellites. However, Russia was currently engaged in conflict in Ukraine and faced sanctions from Western countries, making it uncertain whether they had the funds and technology to pursue such projects. Compared to arming satellites with nuclear weapons, deploying advanced nuclear propulsion electromagnetic weapons systems in space was more challenging and further away from realization. Yet, even the mere possibility of Russia possessing such capabilities was enough to cause concern among U.S. and European officials. Deploying offensive weapons systems in space was a clear violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty signed by Russia, representing a significant escalation. An anonymous U.S. government official stated that Russia's anti-satellite nuclear weapons could have the power equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT explosives. The radiation, high temperatures, electromagnetic pulses, and shock waves produced by the explosion could destroy all satellites within hundreds of kilometers, regardless of ownership. Nowadays, no one who builds satellites has considered defending against such a threat. The delicate sensors are the most vulnerable. A tiny bit of energy can disable them, with just a few joules per square centimeter being enough. Nuclear-powered satellites, which employ lasers or particle beams to eliminate targets, primarily rely on the electromagnetic pulse they generate, rather than causing extensive space debris and radiation. Consequently, this method of attack could also lead to the widespread destruction of satellites, including those of Elon Musk's Starlink satellite internet constellation. Both types of weapons can cause indiscriminate attacks. Destroying American satellites would also impact other countries, even China and Russia's satellites. If there is a nuclear explosion in space, it would generate a large amount of debris ranging from a few millimeters to several centimeters. There are hundreds of millions of tracked space debris orbiting Earth, and it's impossible to control the trajectory or orbit pattern after a collision. Eventually, orbits will become too crowded to be usable. The U.S. and its allies heavily rely on satellite command and control constellations for crucial military communications, intelligence gathering, and targeting. Wouldn't this render Western military commands entirely paralyzed? In the event of a nuclear war, if there are no satellites, neither the White House nor the Pentagon would know the whereabouts of America's 5,244 nuclear warheads, nor whether they have been tampered with. Even if these satellites related to military command are strengthened to survive a nuclear explosion, most commercial satellites are not shielded. If attacked, the global economy and communication systems could be shut down or destroyed for years. In other words, you might have to say goodbye to your current internet connection and the smartphone you're using now. With space-based anti-satellite weapons, Moscow could choose to launch a devastating attack on NATO at any time, a significant bargaining chip to prevent NATO from responding decisively to attacks against member states. This is likely the threat Putin wants to hang over the West. This is why U.S. policymakers have been so agitated recently. U.S. officials have decided to first use diplomatic means to persuade Russia to abandon the plan. This is also one of the reasons why the intelligence on Russia developing new types of space nuclear weapons has not been widely publicized. The Biden administration has been concerned that if the project becomes widely known in Congress or the public, it could undermine U.S. efforts to deter Russia through diplomatic channels. Moreover, if intelligence details were disclosed, sources could dry up. Sources say that one of the communication channels involved U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Yuri Viktorovich Ushakov, an advisor to the President of Russia on foreign policy issues. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the two have spoken multiple times when the U.S. government attempted to warn Moscow against using nuclear or other weapons in mass destruction. Last week, CIA Director William Burns also made contact with Sergei Naryshkin, the director of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. Senior officials from the intelligence community, the White House, and the State Department devised a plan in January to try pressuring Moscow through China and India. U.S. officials have reached out to officials from China and India to raise the concerns of the U.S. and highlighted the potential for China and India's satellites to be destroyed. U.S. officials made further contact with representatives from both countries at the Munich Security Conference on February 17th. Stepping back, if Russia were to launch nuclear weapons into space, that would be madness. The country signed the Outer Space Treaty in 1976, which explicitly prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons or similar objects in space. Business Insider reports that should Russia dare to violate the treaty, other countries would not stand idly by. They might respond with condemnation at the least or sanctions at the worst, further worsening Russia's economic situation. Stephen Anderson, a nuclear analyst at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, points out that if Russia truly sends satellites armed with nuclear bombs into space, it would amount to withdrawing from the Outer Space Treaty. Other countries might follow suit, and the United States could send similar weapons into space. Given the current technological strength of the U.S., it would quickly develop more advanced anti-satellite weapons systems than Russia. If a military conflict between the United States and Russia were to occur one day, the satellites falling from the sky would likely be Russian. The United States has always advocated against the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in space and recently joined other countries in committing to a pause in anti-satellite weapon testing. This is to avoid making space more dangerous. As one of the most famous spacefaring nations, if Russia insists on going against the tide and tearing up over 55 years of legal and geopolitical consensus, celestial politics will enter a new era full of threats, where international rules give way to military and strategic interests. Nuclear weapons in space could have devastating consequences. In July 1962, the U.S. military detonated a fusion bomb in the atmosphere about 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean in an operation known as Starfish Prime. According to National Geographic, the explosion's yield of 1.4 megatons was 500 times that of the atomic bomb dropped by the U.S. on Hiroshima during World War II. At that time, across the ocean, an electromagnetic pulse was visible, burning out hundreds of streetlights in Hawaii 900 miles away. But the most intense effects were felt in space. Within minutes, the explosion created a fireball and a glowing red aurora visible to observers hundreds of miles below. Even crazier, this explosion inadvertently created a radiation belt that lingered for months, circling the Earth and directly killing 8 out of 24 satellites in orbit at the time, including the United Kingdom's first orbital satellite, Ariel 1. A year later, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Currently, there are about 7,000 active satellites in orbit, not to mention the 10 humans aboard the International Space Station and China's Tiangong Space Station. A nuclear explosion in orbit would be a live broadcast of a disaster movie. The aftermath would be even more severe than the event in 1962, with Russia's space assets suffering as well. As the U.S. intelligence community hints to Congress about Russia's plans to move nuclear warheads into space, China's space nuclear program has also been inadvertently revealed. The head of the Chief of Space Operations of the United States Space Force, Bradley Saltzman, stated that China and Russia pose the greatest threats to the U.S. in space. They have developed a plethora of anti-satellite missiles, laser weapons, and orbital interceptors in a bid to dominate space. China's interest in space is not recent. Following the Gulf War in 1991, they realized that the U.S. warfare capabilities heavily depended on space, with approximately 70 to 80% of intelligence and 80% of communications being facilitated through space. China believes that control over space will dictate the initiative in future warfare, even going so far as to say that the first shot in future wars will be fired in space. Essentially, they aim to make space their domain. Now, the U.S. and China are engaged in an arms war in space, continuously developing various space weapons. Richard Fisher, a Chinese military expert at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, also mentioned that China aims to control low Earth orbit to defeat the U.S. on Earth. In 2007, China launched an anti-satellite missile that successfully took down one of its obsolete weather satellites. By 2021, Russia followed suit with its anti-satellite weapon test. In 2021, China also started working on the Tiangong space station. If this space station is further equipped with robotic arms, so-called killer satellites, laser weapons, and electromagnetic guns, it could instantly transform into a space version of a universal soldier, specializing in anti-missile and anti-satellite tasks. A report by the South China Morning Post on April 2022 revealed that Chinese military researchers had developed an artificial intelligence system capable of converting low-cost commercially purposed satellites into space satellites. The U.S. Artemis program is rapidly progressing, fulfilling a plan initiated by former U.S. President Trump. The first phase, Artemis 1, was successfully launched in November 2022, orbiting the Moon. This mission primarily tested the new heavy-lift rocket and spacecraft. The second phase, Artemis 2, planned for 2024, will mark the first crewed mission to orbit the Moon. The third phase, Artemis 3, planned for 2025, aims for another crewed lunar landing. The U.S. has also launched the Strategic Framework for Space Diplomacy to ensure peaceful development and cooperation in space and to counter China's potential threats in the domain. Artemis 1, an uncrewed lunar orbit mission launched in November 2022, aimed to test NASA's Space Launch System, SLS, and its Orion spacecraft, paving the way for future crewed flights. This year, Artemis 2 will take astronauts in a lunar orbit, serving as a rehearsal. Next year, Artemis 3 will carry astronauts to the Moon's surface, an exhilarating prospect. Beyond returning to the Moon, the U.S. released the Strategic Framework for Space Diplomacy, aimed at maintaining peace in space and preventing space dominance. The target of this initiative is clear to all. A day before the U.S. announced this document, China sent 3 astronauts to their space station and declared a human lunar landing by 2030, clearly challenging the U.S. Artemis program. In recent years, China has achieved several successes in space missions, including landing rovers on the far side of the Moon and constructing a new space station. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson has expressed concerns about China's ambitions in space. He warned that if China reaches the Moon first, it could claim it as its own, establish military bases, and prevent other nations from landing there. He also believes China could use lunar resources to develop powerful laser weapons, posing a threat to Earth targets. This would significantly threaten U.S. space programs. Nelson emphasized that this is not a conspiracy theory, but a reality unfolding. He stated that if the U.S. could return to the Moon before China, it would ensure the effectiveness of the Strategic Framework for Space Diplomacy. Many countries are now racing to claim the Moon due to its significant strategic value. Whoever occupies it first will gain the initiative in future space warfare. Satellites in space orbit are all below the lunar orbit, so if a base were established on the Moon, it would be easy to take down those satellites. The absence of an atmosphere on the Moon makes it an ideal location for solar power stations, which would be far more powerful than Earth's satellites. Whoever controls this energy base will have a decisive advantage in future wars. Therefore, the Moon is key to future space battles, and countries are racing to secure a foothold. This is not just talk, but a matter of great importance. The Moon, Earth's satellite, is also a critical strategic base for future space warfare. Whoever occupies the Moon first will have the initiative in future space battles and could even dominate the fate of Earth in the future. This is why nations are desperately vying for the Moon. Countries like the United States, China, and Russia are actively developing their space military capabilities, viewing them as crucial for future conflicts. In the future, space will become a new battleground for humanity, with the Moon being pivotal in this arena. Humanity's future will be written in space.